Great. Thank you, Alyssa. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this presentation on evaluations, the ABCs of evaluations and assessments for students with disabilities. This is clearly a very hot topic and one that I'm so glad people have joined for. Understanding evaluations that are done of students with disabilities can make a huge difference in strengthening an IEP, strengthening IEP goals, holding schools accountable for meeting the needs of students, and a whole host of other reasons. So we're delighted to have you here today. I'm Julie Keegan. I work for Disability Rights New York, and Disability Rights New York houses the New York State Special Education Task Force, but we do not control the New York State Special Education Task Force. The task force has been around for about 20 years now, and its focus has always been on bringing special education stakeholders together to improve outcomes for students with disabilities. And by stakeholders, we mean parents and service providers and school professionals and students and everyone who does play a role in delivering special education to kids. This is part of our annual Lunch and Learn series, and I just wanted to let you know that probably early next week we'll be sending out an announcement about our next presentation, Lunch and Learn, which is going to be on due process hearings. Sort of when do I do that? What is it? Should I do it? Why would I do it? Are there alternatives to due process hearings? So again, that'll be on a Friday, May 15th, around this time. I think it's noon to 1:30 or thereabouts. But again, if you're signed up for this, you will receive notice about that presentation. We don't have a topic after that, but one thing I would really encourage you to do, we're not using the chat function today, but you can message the hosts, or you can even put it in the Q&A if you want to. But we're really looking for topics that this group wants to hear about. We have access to resources across the state to find good speakers to deliver information. And so hearing from you and what would be helpful to you is really important to us. So if you have ideas, feel free to put them in the Q&A or message me, or in the evaluation that we will be asking you to complete after this presentation. You can certainly add it there. Again, we really appreciate that help. We want to make sure these are meaningful to what you're encountering every day. In addition to that, I just wanted to bring your attention to our new website, which is up and available, but is still being populated with more resources and things. But I'll put that link in the chat. It's basically www.nysspechaledtaskforce.org. But I will put that in the chat as well. From there, you can access our YouTube channel, which has, at this point, dozens of recorded presentations through our Lunch and Learn series, as well as events that are held through our regional task forces across the state. There's really wonderful presentations there. This is a huge help to a lot of people who are struggling with something. So we encourage you to check that out. We also have the Special Education Digest, which looks at recent special education decisions that have come out and categorizes them by topic. So, and we try to deliver it in fairly plain language. So if you want to learn about what's happening or what cases are what courts are saying on specific issues, that's a great resource for you. And we also have special education in plain language and our bullying guide on the website. And I will let you know that we are soon to be releasing a plain language guide on the use of timeout and restraints and more effective ways for behavior intervention. So as soon as that's out, we will be letting people know about that. So again, as Alyssa mentioned, if you have questions, we'll be entertaining those. in the last half hour of this presentation. Please, but when you have the questions, just go ahead and pop them in to the Q&A. I'll be sort of monitoring them, and we will be making sure that our speaker can address those at the end. So we appreciate your participation. It's always much more fun and interesting if you do share your questions. That said, we obviously can't get into very specific situations, so there's a balance there. So with that, I do, well, and let me say again, we will be sending out evaluations at the end of this. Please just take the 1 minute to complete those evaluations. They mean a whole lot to us. It helps inform us about the topics and presentations that you, the effective way of delivering presentations, and whether the information is helpful to you or not. So please do that. So with all of that said, I am really, really delighted to introduce you to Fiona Rattray. Fiona is a parent training and information center specialist with the Putnam and Westchester Independent Living Centers. She is super passionate about supporting students with disabilities and their families, and helping them navigate the special education system. Fiona has a background in special education teaching and mentoring and evaluating students with disabilities. She is also the parent of 2 adult children on the autism spectrum and a region director for the New York State Parent Teacher Association. So she comes to us well qualified to share her expertise and strategies and insight on evaluations today. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Fiona. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, Julie. Hi, everybody. So glad you could join us today. So what I'm actually going to do today is I'm going to throw you straight into the deep end. And I'm going to do it by showing you a little bit of a report from an evaluation. So I'm going to take us on to the next page to do that. There we go. Okay. So this is actually an excerpt from an evaluation. And the reason I'm sharing it with you is because it's one of the things that prompted me to put together this training. The fact that we are bombarded as parents with information that is often very difficult for us to really understand and take useful information away from. So if we look at this one, I'm not going to read it out to you, but you can see there it's a very wordy little paragraph, and it comes from a speech evaluation. I can tell you with absolute confidence that if you were sitting in a CSE meeting with the psychologist, the CSE chair, the special ed teacher, the gen ed teacher, and the other people who are supposed to be in the room, your speech therapist will understand what this means. Maybe your psychologist will understand a little bit of it, maybe the CSE chair, but most people in that room are not really going to know what this means because this is very specialized language, and this is one of the issues we come across with evaluations. So what does it actually mean? It means quite simply that this particular child has shorter sentences than are expected for his age. And it also means that he sometimes uses grammar, such as verb tenses, incorrectly. So instead of saying, yesterday I went to the park and had a wonderful time, which is a nice long sentence telling you a lot about that particular experience, he would just say, yesterday I go park. Okay, so very short and not using the correct tense. So the first thing I want to say to you is, whenever you get an evaluation, if you are having to look at wording like this and really scratching your head, you do have the right to go back to the school district, back to the person that did the evaluation in the first place, and ask for the information in plain language. So that's the first thing I wanted to say to you. So what are we going to do today? What we're going to do is try and demystify the whole evaluation process a little bit, because it's murky, it's stressful. Parents don't always know what to ask for or what they're entitled to for their children. So we're going to go through these particular areas. So why are we doing it in the first place? What can be used? Does your opinion matter when we're looking at all of this information together in the CSE meeting? What do the results actually mean? And what happens next? And I just want to apologize. I usually have an interactive element to this where I can ask you questions and we can all see your answers, but I couldn't get that up and running today. So I do apologize. You are going to hear a lot of my voice. So we're starting out with looking at the purpose of the evaluation, okay? And we're talking here about what we call a comprehensive evaluation. So this is where you have referred your child to the Office for Special Education because you have concerns about what's happening in school and how they're managing. And this is the evaluation that should be taking place. It can also be used if the child's been referred for a 504, but what might be included in that evaluation differs a little when it's a 504. So its purpose is to identify learning strengths and needs of the child. So we are looking, yes, at the areas where they struggle. So for example, if the child's been referred for reading, how is it that they are struggling with reading? Are they particularly slow? Do they have difficulty with some of the vocabulary and understanding what it means? Or are we getting down to, them not even being able to read the word in the first place and actually understand how those letters make sounds and how they fit together? But we also want to know the strengths. Is this a student who has the ability to keep going at things even when they're difficult? Is this a student who is verbally very able but just has difficulty when it comes to reading and writing? So it should be those things. It should determine if a disability is present. Now, school evaluation is not going to give you a diagnosis. Schools cannot provide a diagnosis. That needs to come from a physician. However, they can determine if your child has certain characteristics, difficulties, deficits, however you want to call it, that add up to the likelihood of them having this particular disability. It helps everybody involved with teaching the child to understand how the challenges are affecting their learning. So we're not just looking to see what they can and can't do. We also want to see how are they learning, what works for them, what doesn't work for them. Where are we going to need to come in with some supports or some additional teaching? Because one child struggling with reading is different to another child struggling with reading. It could be entirely different reasons going on in the background. So we need to understand not just where they're at, but how and why they are at that point. And then we're going to use that as a guide to support planning. And in most instances, for parents who are here today, that's going to be planning the IEP, the Individual Education Programme. And we want to establish a shared understanding of students' needs. And I think sometimes this is where evaluations can break down a little bit, that the school might have one perception, your child may have their own perception if they're able to articulate it, and you may have a completely different perception. What we really want is everyone on the same page so that we're all in agreement as to what we need to be doing to support this student. So when does it happen? You have your initial eligibility evaluation, which is when your child is first referred to the Office for Special Education, and you do that formally, you write and you request it. But it also should occur every 3 years. Once your child has an IEP, the schools have to review that every 3 years. Why? Because we want to see if there have been any significant changes. Do they still need the same services? Do they, in a best case scenario, your child may be thriving and may have closed that gap and we can start to pull away some of the services. Either way, we want to be looking at it at least every 3 years. So that is sometimes called your re-evaluation or your triennial review. And this is what we're talking about today, that type of evaluation. However, you can have evaluations at other times. So for example, if you disagree with an evaluation, you can request more testing. You can go back and say, I think you missed this area. Can we please have, so again, if we go back to the reading example, I don't see much about their phonological awareness, that understanding of letters and sounds and how they work together. Can we do a test that specifically looks at that? In some cases, when you disagree with an evaluation, you can request what's called an independent educational evaluation at district expense. We will talk about that more towards the end of this presentation. And you can request additional evaluations at any time. So obviously, they're very much on our minds when we're having an official evaluation, either at the beginning of the process or that one that you have every 3 years. But at any point, if your child's needs are changing, if you can see that the supports they're getting are not working and we're not really moving anywhere, we're not closing that gap, then you can go back and say, do we need to look at this in more detail and request those additional evaluations? So they can be done at any time. You will, if you request that, have to sign a consent to evaluate. That's the one thing you need to know. The school cannot go ahead and do those evaluations unless you have signed the consent to evaluate. So here's where we get down into the nitty-gritty. What should be included? So what you have here, I want you to focus first of all on the left-hand side of this page, where we have social history, psychological evaluation, educational evaluation, and so on. These are the things that have to be included in a comprehensive educational evaluation under IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. In other words, it's not a correct and comprehensive evaluation if it doesn't include these things. The social history is where they're going to talk to you and get some background about your child. So things like, how did the birth go? What were the, when did your child reach or not reach developmental milestones? Anything else that you've noticed about your child's development or behaviors. A psychological evaluation. This is going to be, it's not, when we talk psychological, I want to be absolutely clear here. We're not talking about whether or not someone's a psychopath or, has some sort of mental health disorder. We're talking about understanding how your child learns and processes information. That's the purpose of that evaluation. Then there's an educational evaluation. We have some broad tools that schools use to do these, and they look mainly at things like reading skills, comprehension, writing, spelling, addition, multiplication, all those basic things that we need to learn. Then there's going to be at least one classroom observation because we want to see how this is working in practice, how your child is coping in the classroom. And then any other relevant testing. And this is where the questions start to arise because as parents, we don't always know what the other relevant testing might be. It could be that your child needs an occupational therapy evaluation, for example. This might be because they're struggling with handwriting. So we want to look at their visual motor integration skills. How do they manage to form letters and balance things out on the page and put the pencil in the right place and space things out correctly, but also the grip that they have in their hands, their ability to hold the pencil correctly, their ability to apply the right amount of pressure. All of this can be looked at in an occupational therapy evaluation. Other relevant testing, and we're going to talk more about this as we go through, could be speech testing, could be PT or physical testing, which looks at the bigger muscle areas in the body. It could be looking at emotional functioning, behavioral functioning. There may be visual testing that we need to do. We could look at sensory areas. So we can go into all kinds of areas with the testing. It needs to be relevant to the individual child. And that is why IDEA leaves it to the team to decide what additional testing is needed. So when you're putting in a request for an initial evaluation, make sure that you are as fully informed as possible as to the testing that's required, particularly if, for example, you have a child with a diagnosis of autism or a suspected autism, you need to know that there may be some additional tests that you want to ask for. I would argue, and Julie or any of the other hosts are more than welcome to pitch in at this point, but I would argue that we need a little bit more information than that. So when we're looking at social history, I think it's important to take into account family history as well, which might not always be evident from the questions you're given for social history. When we're looking at family history, if you've got dyslexia in the family, that's information that's relevant because dyslexia is often inherited, as is ADHD, as is autism. So I would say family history is quite important here, especially if the parent had an IEP themselves when they were younger. Any private testing that you've had is something that you also need to bring the results. You do not have to, you're not obliged to bring your private testing results. On the whole, I would recommend that you do. The school has to consider them, the district has to consider them. They do not have to abide by the recommendations for many private tests, but they do need, they can look at them and take them into account. Something that's often missed is your child's viewpoint. Your child's the one that's actually there in the classroom experiencing the difficulties and challenges on a day-to-day basis. It's really important to have their input when we're looking at doing a comprehensive evaluation. If it's a younger child, say 12 years old, they do not have to be in the CSE meeting. Once you're in high school, as a student, you have to attend that meeting as well, but middle schoolers do not have to. I would say it's a good idea to start bringing them to the meetings as early as possible and have them accustomed to doing that by middle school, but most of the time they're not going to be there. And in middle school, you may have a meeting where the team decides that one of the things your child needs is a one-to-one aid. And suddenly the next day, the child's got a if it's handled badly, a one-to-one aid in the classroom. And if they are a self-conscious 13-year-old, they might not want to have somebody sitting next to them every single lesson. So we need to have their viewpoint as part of this evaluation process. Any additional observations are important. They may have come from a former teacher. They may have come from a family member. If it's relevant to what we're talking about in terms of how your child deals with school, then we want that information in there. And we want to look at the evidence of impact. And that evidence could come from you collecting samples of schoolwork and putting them in a folder and highlighting the areas where you see the issues. It could come from, if you're comfortable doing it, you making a video recording and an audio recording of your child. That little report that we started out with, where I threw you in at the deep end, in that particular case, the school was arguing that the child no longer needed speech therapy. And the mum was saying, well, he is still stuttering, he's still struggling with certain enunciation of certain sounds. I don't feel that his speech is where they say it is in the evaluation. And so what I encouraged the mum to do in that situation was to record her child speaking at home when in one of those situations. It tended to be when he was excited or stressed, his ability to enunciate and speak clearly started to deteriorate. So I encouraged her to record that. One of the things that we have to bear in mind with evaluations is it's a tiny snapshot. If we were just focusing on the test results alone, they are a snapshot. We need to look at the whole picture. Are there any questions at this point, Julie?
We do have some questions.
Yeah.
I didn't know if you want to do it now or if you want to wait till the end.
I'm happy to do a couple now because it breaks things up a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I think that's fine, and I appreciate that people are sending them as they come in. Can I also say, when you were talking about what to think about when you're evaluating a child and the observations and what something that really hit home for us recently, we've been doing a lot of work with the St. Regis Mohawk tribe in northern New York. And it was a great reminder that understanding the cultural background of the student is extremely important.
Yeah.
Different cultures view disability different ways. Their cultural trauma, generational trauma that can be a huge issue. There's just a lot that goes into that. And so how we might approach a student could very well differ, or getting the parents involved too, or on board with a certain approach, like if there's behavior or whatever. So I just wanted to add that piece. And okay, so first question, how do you get the classroom observation completed for an evaluation for a student who is homeschooled?
Okay, I have to admit, that's something I've not come across before, but I would imagine that what we're doing there is that you're going to have to make an arrangement with the home district to have someone come in and see your child being homeschooled. They're the ones that are going to be writing the IEP, so they need to have someone from the district come in and do the observation.
I agree with that too. I've never run into that specific situation, but I think that would be, I mean, a district certainly couldn't say they're not in school, so we can't do that, so forget it.
Yeah,
Um,
I would consider the timing though if you're doing that, because if you've got a child that is fairly calm at the beginning of the day and things start to tail off towards the end of the day, you don't want someone coming doing that evaluation first thing in the morning, because they're going to see your child at their best and they may underestimate what's going on in terms of challenges.
that's great. That's a great observation. Next question, is the school required to pay for or conduct a psychiatric evaluation if mental health supports are necessary for students to access their learning?
I believe they are, but we're on a kind of it's yes, I believe they are. Julie, do you have a we've got some good
Um,
questions coming in
it,
here.
it's an interesting question.
Yeah.
I mean, typically, no, a psychiatric evaluation isn't needed, nor can a school district say you have to have a specific diagnosis before we'll look at special education. That said, having information from a medical provider or a clinical psychologist who has said your child's on the autism spectrum or has this diagnosis, that can really help inform the CSE about what the student's individual needs might be, although they can't just say, oh, you're on the spectrum, so you get this service. Like that doesn't have, it has to be based on the individual needs. But I think I, I have not come across a situation where a psychiatric evaluation by the district is, I've seen it in two instances in 20 years
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
that has come into play. Because it's sort of similar to the medical diagnosis. If it's something that you can get through your own insurance or whatever that would help inform, that might be helpful. But there may be extreme circumstances where there is a mental health condition where that is really needed. And then if that's the case, the district would have to pay for it.
Yeah. That was what I
Well,
was thinking. Thank you for clarifying that, Julie.
Okay, and everybody needs to mute themselves, okay? Because we're doing Q&A through the question and answer link. So I'm just going to ask everybody to mute themselves. So the next question is, do you typically advise getting a speech language OT PT evaluation with as part of a comprehensive evaluation?
No, it depends on the child's individual needs. So every child is going to have, and we will look at this in more detail in a minute, the psychological evaluation and the academic evaluation. Then the additional evaluations are very much dependent on what we're being presented with, the reasons that we're asking for the child to be evaluated. So if you're looking at a child who has reading difficulties, there's not really any reason for them to have a PT evaluation, for example. We would only be asking for a PT evaluation if we're seeing difficulties with, say, them walking around school, participating in phys ed, maybe there was something else that came to mind on that one, but it's if they're kind of seeming to be a bit clumsy in the classroom and tripping over things and having difficulty in that respect, then you might want to have a PT evaluation. But no, you don't want to be looking at every single area unless it's absolutely necessary and you've got a really complex case.
Right. I mean, the district's required to evaluate all areas of suspected disability. So, I mean, if there are concerns about, if you have an inkling that there might be a sensory issue or a communication issue or whatever, then yeah, it's worth it. It would be worth it, to ask for that. But if there isn't any indication, maybe not. Those are the questions that are relevant for right now,
Yeah.
Fiona, and I'm saving the other ones that are coming in, for later as we go
Okay.
on. Thank
Thank
you.
you. So I'm going to move on. Okay, so what tests are we looking at is the next question. And the key questions are, what are we actually trying to find out here? So it's different according to the age of your child, for example. So early intervention before the age of 2, what we're trying to find out from the evaluation is there a developmental delay of 33% in one domain or 25% or more in 2 domains? And we'll talk about what those domains are in a minute. Once we get to the preschool level, so we're talking about 3-year-olds now, does the student have a disability that negatively impacts their ability to function in an educational setting? So a difference there. The early intervention is very specific. We're looking for those developmental delays, and they have to be to a specific degree. With preschool, we're looking in more general terms at whether or not there is a disability and how is it impacting them in a classroom setting. And then with school age, again, sorry, it's going, my thing's going a bit crazy here. Okay, with school age, no. I apologize. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay, I don't have my normal mouse at the moment, so I'm having to use the one on the laptop. Okay, school age is a little bit more specific. Again, we are looking at, does the child have one of 13 disability classifications? So for example, autism, specific learning disability, they might have a speech language disorder, they might have a physical disability. So we're looking to see what category best fits that child and do they fit that classification? And then does that disability adversely affect their ability to access the curriculum? So you could, for example, have a diagnosis of autism, but it might not adversely affect your ability to access the curriculum. I think that's fairly unusual, but it does happen. So just having the disability alone is not going to qualify you for support. We're also looking at how does it actually impact you when you're in school. Again, I'm going the wrong way. Right, let's go like this. That should do the trick. Okay. All right. So those core testing areas that we're looking at, if it's for early intervention, we're looking at cognitive, communication, physical, social, emotional, adaptive. And remember, if a child is more than 33% delayed in any one of those areas, they would qualify for early intervention. So adaptive would be things like, starting to think about what we're doing with our hands. Are we using a fork yet, for example, to put food in our mouths? Cognitive, are we able to figure out challenges? My ball is on the other side of the room and it went behind the table. Can I figure out how to get my ball back? That's what cognitive is about. Communication, physical, social, and emotional, I think are fairly self-explanatory. At preschool, they are going to then do a psychological test. So they're going to look at how the brain deals with things like retaining information and manipulating information. They're going to ask for a social history. They're going to do an observation, and they're going to do a physical examination to make sure that there isn't something else that's getting in the way. And then at school age, we have to have that psychological evaluation that we talked about before, the social history, the observation in class, and we have to have the educational evaluation. So that's going to be your broad one, and then the additional evaluations according to the reason why we referred your child in the first place. How do you know as a parent what to ask for? How can you possibly figure this out? It's a conundrum, isn't it? There are things that you can do. So the first thing I would say is research your child's disability. So I'm going to take autism as an example. That's one that I'm particularly familiar with. With autism, obviously, we're looking at potential issues with communication. We're possibly looking at rigid behaviors. We're looking at sensitivity. It could be acute sensitivity. We're looking at areas that cross over into other disabilities. So for example, reduced attention, which can come with ADHD, but it can also come with autism. Sensory issues, another area that we want to look at with autism. There are high correlations. If we look at things like dysgraphia, which is a difficulty with writing, and autism. In other words, if you have autism, you have a higher likelihood of having dysgraphia. So you want to do that research, because once you start to pin down those areas where your child might be challenged and you're recognizing them, hopefully, and you're saying, yeah, that I can see that happening when they're doing their homework, then you can start to look into the tests that you can be asking for. I personally feel quite strongly that if a school is testing a child for autism, they need to have behavior scales in there, but they also need to be looking at their sensory issues. And oftentimes a sensory evaluation is not included in a comprehensive evaluation for a student suspected of having autism. They also need to look at their pragmatic language ability. That's your social language, and that often gets left out as well. So informing yourselves as parents enables you to say, have you included this? If it's a re-evaluation, that 3-yearly one, take a look at what they did last time around, because we should at the very least be doing those tests again. There may be one of those tests, for example, your child might have started out with PT as on the basis of the testing they had the first time around, but they have managed to meet their targets in PT and have tested out of PT. If that's the case, then you don't need to repeat that PT test. I hope that makes sense. Check special education websites. There are some phenomenal special education websites out there. Understood, Rights Law, A Day in Our Shoes. You can go for more specific websites like IDA, which is the International Dyslexia Association, or Attitude, which is a prominent ADHD website. And they have articles. Understood, you can literally just put a question into Google, or rather a search, and just say understood tests for dyslexia, and it will give you a list of tests, and it will explain not just why we use those tests, but also alternatives to those tests if the school doesn't have them, for example. Talk to other parents. I couldn't have got through the whole process with my kids without knowing other parents. It's always useful to, in particular, know a parent who's got kids maybe a year or two older than your child, because they will know what was done with theirs and be able to advise you. And if you're really stuck, you can call someone like us. I work for a parent training and information centre. We have them across New York, and we're there to provide free advice to parents of children with disabilities. So those core tests, remember I said academic testing and psychological testing. So these are the tests that you're most likely to see. So pretty much any IEP that I look at, or any initial evaluation that I look at, is going to have something from the green column and something from the blue column. Which ones they pick are going to be contingent partly on your child's age. So if you look at the top there on the green section, you're going to see the WPPSI 4, which is for younger children. Okay, the WISC is the one that most of you, if you have school-age children, will have written on your IEP. There is another one that goes beyond the WISC for children aged 16 and up. This is going to be particularly useful if you have a child and you're looking to get them something like OPWD services, and you need to have an adult psychological evaluation. And then there are some psychological evaluations that are non-verbal, because obviously if you have a reading issue, you may struggle with the regular evaluation. And there are two here that you can see. There's the Stanford Binet and the TONI, which is the test of non-verbal intelligence. Do they give you a hard and fast piece of data about what your child can and can't do? No, right? They give you a good idea of what your child can and can't do at this particular moment in time. And generally speaking, as your child gets tested again and again, if they end up having an IEP all the way to the age of 18, you should be seeing fairly similar scores on these. They shouldn't be changing massively. However, if you have a child with autism, we have to be looking at other data here. We should not be making an assumption. This will give you, this test, an IQ score. It will give you a full scale IQ. I'd be very wary with autistic kids, even if they're verbal, that is a reliable indicator of what they're capable of, because they sometimes interpret the test differently. They're not written for people with autism. The academic testing, mostly you're going to see these three tests being used, and these are the ones we talked about earlier that look in a broad way at those key skills that we need for the classroom. So your reading, writing, spelling, arithmetic, and so on. Deeper academic testing is what we're going to need if a child has been referred because they're really struggling with reading, spelling, writing, comprehension, mathematics. So we need to make sure that these tests are being included. So for example, with reading, some of those broad tests that we had on the previous page do have subtests that can be used by examiners, okay? However, I would say that we also need to be looking at other testing that goes into specifics. So the CTOP2, which is the third one down there, this is a test that is purely focused on phonological processing and understanding. So knowing that an A sound can sound like an A or an A or an R, and how that looks in different words and how we read them. That is your phonological understanding. So you can ask for these additional tests if your child is being referred partly because of reading issues. In a good situation, the district is going to recommend these tests rather, but it doesn't always happen. Same thing with writing. Okay, so there are some written expression tests that can be included as part of that broader academic testing. That's why they're highlighted in a slightly different color. But we're probably going to have to go a bit deeper when we're looking at written expression. Okay, and if it's purely your child struggling to put the words together and put them down on paper, then we're going to be looking at these tests below. But if it's actually that your child has difficulty in terms of just even writing legibly, we're going to need an occupational therapy evaluation as well. And then math, again, the broad testing includes some elements of math. But if you want to dig deeper, you need something like the FAM, which is the FIFA assessment of mathematics, or Key Math 3, which is another more comprehensive test. The reason, so if I'm going to just go really like a little bit further with these and say, you've all heard of dyslexia. I just mentioned dysgraphia, which is a disorder with writing. There's also one called dyscalculia or dyscalculia. People say it different ways. And that's a disability, a specific disability in math. And it's not always easy to explain it or even, discover it, if you like, through that broad academic testing. We're going to have to look a lot deeper to figure out whether or not this is a specific math disability. And so this is why you need to be as informed as possible as parents. Okay. So we said other relevant testing. So here are some examples of other relevant testing. I've used areas that are frequently tested, such as speech, fine motor, gross motor, and neurodevelopmental. That doesn't mean these are the only additional tests available. For example, as I've said underneath, you may have different testing if you're looking at a child with visual impairment. That's, far more, they might have a full evaluation that's purely focused on their visual skills. But these can be broken down into different areas. So when we're looking at these areas, there are tests that are commonly used by schools, but sometimes those tests might not give us all of the data that we need, and we may need to ask for additional ones. I'm going to show you on the next page, and I'm hoping most of you will recognize some of these tests. I'll give you a minute to take a look at them. So executive functioning is basically your mind's ability to manage itself. Okay, so to understand time and when to be on time for something, to prioritize what you're supposed to be doing, to remember what to put in your book bag, for example. So that's your executive functioning. Pragmatic language, as I said before, is that social language, the ability to have a conversation with another person. Speech is, those speech evaluations are really looking more at how much vocabulary does the child have? Do they understand the words they should be understanding at this stage in their education? How do they articulate the words? Are they able to, produce coherent sentences? Fine motor skills is going to look at, mainly your hands and how we are using those hands. Can we write clearly? Can we draw a circle? Can we use a pair of scissors? Can we follow a maze or a dot to dot, that kind of thing. But it's also not just looking at your ability to do that, but your strength, and also how that ties in with what you're seeing and your hand responding to what you're seeing. Gross motor, hopping, jumping, skipping, running, that kind of thing. Sensory is, I'm actually doing a presentation tomorrow lunchtime on sensory issues. Sensory issues are, I think, massively overlooked and can be profound for some people, and they cover way more areas than you would think. So it's not just about touch, taste, smell, hearing, etc. It's also about how your body processes things, how it feels in space even. Then emotional, we're looking at, is this somebody who may be prone to depression or aggression or non-compliance or anxiety? So we can do scales to look at that. And then adaptive functioning. This is going to mainly be used for children that have a developmental disability or autism, or if that's what we suspect they have, and we're looking at their ability to function on a day-to-day basis there. Just to give you an example of why we have more than one test in these areas. So if you look, for example, at the motor testing, the gross motor, that's in the bottom corner there on the left. The BOT, and you're going to see a lot of these acronyms when it comes to tests, because a lot of them have names that no one's going to remember. So I will tell you that the BOT stands for, if I get this right, the Brunings-Ozorowski or something like that test. Okay, so we just refer to it, generally speaking, as the BOT2. That tests coordination and balance. We then would use the PDMS2 to look at early development and milestones. So, is this person walking the way they should be? Did they crawl? That kind of thing. And then TGND3 looks at the way somebody actually moves around and any patterns that they may have to their movement. Do they walk a certain way? Do they have an unusual gait, for example? By the way, I will be sending a copy of this out, so you will all get a copy of this slideshow in PDF format afterwards. Okay, two more assessments that I just wanted to bring to your attention. One is functional behavior assessments. Remember, all of these ones that we've been talking about on the last 2 pages, these are not automatically included. So they're going to be included either because the school recommends that they're included or because you've asked and they've agreed to include them. So a functional behavior assessment is there when we are looking at behaviors that are really getting in the way of a child's ability to learn. So if we've got a child that's frequently running out of the classroom, for example, then we need to do an assessment to figure out why are they running out of the classroom and what's triggering them to run out of the classroom. And how do we do that? It's done by observing the child over a period of time, looking for patterns, gathering data from both parents and the school to try and figure out why this child is leaving the classroom on a regular basis. And we may discover from a functional behavioral assessment that they always run out of the classroom when it's time for math. Or it may be that they always run out of the classroom, and that would be obviously because they struggle with math. Or maybe they always run out of the classroom between morning recess and lunchtime. And we may discover that they're drinking 2 pints of Gatorade at morning recess, and that's why they're running out of the classroom, because they need a bathroom. So we're trying to get to the bottom of the behavior that's getting in the way of their learning. And these have to be conducted by a professional trained in behavioral analysis. And these can be part of a comprehensive evaluation, and they can inform a comprehensive evaluation. And then the other one is assistive technology evaluations. Why do we do those? To improve access to learning. We do it when a student struggles with output, and anything to do with comprehension, reading, writing, any independence. And it can also be to do things like focus. There is actually technology that can help with things like focusing as well. That's a whole different topic for another day. I just want you to be aware that you can ask for one. And it should include, again, it will be done with someone who's trained in this, and they will observe your child in a kind of classroom setting, and they will try different bits of equipment out with them and see what is going to work for your child's needs. And so that's conducted by a trained specialist. I'm down in the Lower Hudson Valley. We have trained specialists at the Westchester Institute for Human Development, for example. This is one that sometimes it's a little difficult to get the school to agree to doing it. I actually am hoping as time moves forward that this becomes part of what every school has to do as part of a comprehensive evaluation, because what's coming in is, I mean, every year I'm looking at different equipment, different apps that support learning. And we're obviously we're becoming more and more reliant on technology anyway. So a child having this evaluation may come away with a set of recommendations that go back to the school as to what they're going to need. And it could be something really, really simple. I mean, you know, if your child has difficulty holding a pencil correctly, it could be a pencil grip. In a sense, that's assistive technology. But then we can go all the other way to much more complex technology. For example, an FM system. An FM system is used for children that may have a hearing difficulty or auditory processing disorder or attentional issues, where the teacher has a little microphone attached to their clothing, and as they're speaking, the child is wearing a headset and the sound is going straight into their ears without any distraction. And there's loads of other stuff, but that's something you can look into if you're interested in it. Are there any more questions at this point?
There are.
I thought there might be.
Some of them have been answered though, and I want to speak on behalf of everybody that having some suggested tests for each of those areas is extremely helpful. So thank you for including those. And as you said, and I said in the chat, we will be providing this presentation in written form after this event. Okay, so interesting question. Would teacher reports count as classroom observations? And there wasn't a qualifier on that. So it came in after we were talking about how do you do an observation if the child's on home instruction. But other than that, so I think maybe we answer it in both contexts. Do you have a thought?
I mean, no, a teacher report is not an observation. An observation is where a third party comes into the room during the lesson and observes the child and what's going on in the classroom. There's no way you could do that as a teacher. You can certainly write a report and say what you are seeing and experiencing and what you think the child is experiencing as challenges, but an observation should be a third party coming into the room and sitting quietly and just observing what's happening.
Thank you. This was just something shared as an observation, also relevant to our prior discussion. But the person writes that they found that once their child got a medical diagnosis, it made requesting services and advocating for him a lot easier. So I think that's something we talked about. Okay. Here's a great question. I would like the presenter to discuss evaluations for multilingual learners and English language learners.
Oh boy.
Yes, I know. And noting that it's sometimes hard to distinguish between is the barrier caused by a language issue, or is there truly a special education need here? So I wondered if you had any thoughts.
Yes, certainly. The first thing I would say is you do have the right, if say Spanish is your child's first language, to request those evaluations in Spanish, and there are providers that can do that. Having said that, there are not every single evaluation that's available to a Spanish evaluator is going to match up exactly with the evaluations that schools generally use. There are some that have Spanish versions. but not all of them, especially when we get into those more specialist tests for reading, for example, or pragmatic language disorders and that kind of thing. So this is where it's really important to bring your own information to the table. I've actually been dealing with a case recently that is exactly that, and the evaluation was carried out in Spanish, and everybody wanted, I feel, like the evaluator, the district, to say, oh, this is all just because of a gap in schooling, because the child had come from a war-torn country where there can be gaps in schooling. And the parent was saying, no, no, no. From the word go, from the age of 5, he has struggled with reading in his home language, and obviously now he's struggling in English. So it's about bringing as much information to the table as you can. So I referred earlier to the fact that it's really important to mention that, you know, if your child has a parent or a sibling or even an uncle, because sometimes it skips around in generations, that had dyslexia and needed supports for it, that is relevant information. So yes, the testing can take place, but make sure that everybody is really aware of the context and what exposure to teaching your child has had, and any observations that you're making at home. For example, children with reading issues that are really good at masking it oftentimes, especially if they're more cognitively able children. So, you know, they may be saying to you, well, he's reading fine in school. Well, but your child might have actually just memorized the book if it's a short reading book, and they just know, you know, what when someone turns the page, they look at the picture. Okay, I remember these words go with that picture. That does not mean they are reading. So we want to, again, and this is why I'm saying this today, I personally believe with any evaluation, you want to bring all relevant information to the table, and it needs to be given equal weight. That often isn't the case because we're accustomed to a system where, you know, rightly, we look at the educators as the guides and say, okay, what do you think? And we sometimes feel as parents that maybe we are not qualified to, you know, speak up and talk about our children, but you're the one seeing them. You've known them their whole lives, you know their background, you're seeing what they're struggling with, you're hearing what they're saying when they're coming home. So I guess my argument here is it applies to any evaluation, but particularly if you're looking at languages, other languages, that you have as much data as possible. I know that's not a really satisfactory answer, but that's the best I can give.
Sure. Okay. Is a dyscalculia evaluation something the school would perform on their own, or would a parent need to request it?
You probably need to ask about it, because I'm not sure that all schools even know that dyscalculia is a thing. I hate to say that, but it's absolutely true. If you look at dyslexia, for example, for every 13 books written about dyslexia, I think there's maybe one written about dyscalculia. It wasn't something anybody had really heard of until maybe the last 20 years, I would say. When I did my training in specific learning disabilities, it was all about reading and writing. We didn't touch on math once, but that was 20 years ago. So yes, ask for it. They're not necessarily going to suggest it. And there are some really big clues when a kid has dyscalculia, especially if they're older. If you've got a 10, 11-year-old that's still counting on their fingers, there's a strong likelihood that we need to be looking at dyscalculia there, because we should not be counting on our fingers at that age.
Yeah, thank you. For reading, writing, and math tests that are specialized, are they limited by age or age ranges?
Some of them are, yes. And on when you get your copy of this, you'll actually see, I didn't draw your attention to it before, but those tests that I showed you before, they were all, you can take it as read that they're all tests that can be used for school age children, but I'd also indicated with asterisks the ones that can be used as young as, you know, 2 years old, and the ones that can be used for CPSE, so for preschoolers. Some tests, the TONI, for example, the test of nonverbal intelligence, you can't do that with a child until they're 6. So yes, most tests, the age ranges tend to be school age up till 84, 85, but there are some where we do have to make sure that the child is within a specific age range.
Okay. This is along the same lines, and it's a little technical, so whatever. Is there a specific test parents can request if they have for hyperlexia? Um, this person's son started reading at 2.5, but developmental pediatrician recommended waiting until 5 for official testing. Can the school test for hyperlexia and at a younger age?
I've not come across a test that specifically is geared towards hyperlexia. Just so that everybody knows what that means. Hyperlexia is when a child can read words usually way before the age that you would normally expect them to be able to read. So the actual physical reading is something, it's a skill they acquire really quickly. The issue with hyperlexia, and you often get hyperlexia in, again, autistic individuals, is that whilst they may be able to read the words really well, they don't necessarily understand the words, particularly when we're looking at extended reading. So when we're looking at paragraphs, you may have a child that can read that paragraph perfectly, doesn't mean that they're going to be able to understand it. So rather than looking for the hyperlexia, what you're really looking for is, okay, this child can decode really well. They can read any word I put in front of them practically, but do they understand the words? And do they understand the text when they're looking at paragraphs and reading books? And there are tests that can pick that out, such as the Gray Oral Reading Test.
Right. But given that it's a comprehension issue, it may be hard to do that at 2 years old. So
Oh, 2 years
I
old, sorry.
don't, so I think it would be worthwhile to look at the tests you recommended that look at reading comprehension and
Yeah.
see what the age limits are for them, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. With the academic testing, there isn't as much academic testing for children under 5 because we don't expect most children under 5 to be doing multiplication and reading sentences. So that's why those tests don't really exist.
Thank you. Would an AT evaluation limit the kinds of devices or assistive technology that might be recommended for a student?
It shouldn't. It shouldn't limit anything. I mean, you might find that a child is using a certain kind of technology, and when they have an AT evaluation, the evaluator finds that that's not actually working as well for them as we thought it was, and therefore we're going to look at other technology that might be more effective. But I don't see that, and I can't think of an instance whereby it would limit. It's more likely that it's going to expand the information about what the child needs. Whether or not the school then is providing that assistive technology is a whole other question.
Right. Well, the second part of that question is, can the family request, say, an iPad if the student's using an iPad at home? But like anything in special education, there can be recommendations, but the school ultimately gets to choose what the methodology is, what the thing is, as long as it meets the needs of the student. So sometimes parents want a specific thing, but if there's something else that meets the needs, then the district has the right to recommend something else.
Yeah, so they would look at the iPad and the way that your child uses the iPad and say, is the best way for your child to perform those functions, or is there another way we can do this? And that, inevitably, because they have a responsibility to, they're also going to look at cost. So it would be, what is the child using the iPad for? What do we already have that will fulfill that requirement that isn't necessarily an iPad? And is there anything missing a gap that we can fill with something else? Or they may, conclude that the iPad is the best tool for your child.
Thank you. As part of an evaluation for initial eligibility, can the classroom observation be done by anyone, such as an assistant principal? Is the same credit given if it is not done by a behaviorist or school psychologist?
Okay, usually it's not going to be done by a behaviorist unless there's a behavioral concern. Um, that's I mean, the classroom observation, we're looking, you've got to remember that with an IEP, we're looking at the impact on the child's ability to learn. So your special ed teacher or your psychologist are probably going to be the best people to go in and do that classroom observation. Um, it would depend if the assistant principal had experience in that area. I mean, schools are going to use the resources that they have available to them. Julie, do you want to add anything on that?
No, I agree with you completely. I mean, it is typically the school psychologist that is doing the classroom observation. And I know you want to get, I know I'm looking at the time, Fiona, too. Like there's a few more questions here. But how much more time do you need to finish your presentation,
Probably
do
about
you think?
15 minutes, something like that. Let's get going. I'll keep going. All right.
Okay.
Okay. So does your opinion matter? Does the school have to listen to you? Technically, yes. The CSE committee, and you are part of the CSE committee, the Committee for Special Education, has to have the parent on it or the parents. And theoretically, everyone on that committee is just as important as the next person. Does it feel that way when you walk into the room and you've got everybody from the district sitting there around the table waiting for you to come in? No, it doesn't really feel that way, but that is how it's supposed to be. So what you want to do is, yes, understand and recognize that both your and your child's voice are really important in this process, but use that voice wisely. Use data and documentation. Right, opinions are not going to cut it here. We want to have solid information. So you could go in and say, all right, I really think my child's struggling with reading. Well, if you go in with a little bit more information than that, tangible data they can use, then they're far more likely to pay attention to what you're saying. So you say, I've been told that they're at reading level J. I've been getting books out of the library for reading level J, and they can't even read the first page. They can't even do the first sentence. That is giving them data. So data, big thing. Okay. And it doesn't have to be super technical. You don't have to be a reading teacher to pull together that data. You can just say they are constantly, swapping words around or missing words or mispronouncing words or completely omitting words when they're reading, that they're really struggling with those longer words. In education, we'll call them polysyllabic or multisyllabic words, but you can just say longer words. And you can cite instances of what you're seeing. So, your child may have had to do some sort of assignment about animals on the African plain or in the African savannah, okay? And if your child can talk to you, and again, we see this a lot with kids with ADHD and autism, and a lot of kids with dyslexia, they can talk really eloquently about a lion, and they can say, oh, lions are majestic creatures that dominate the African savannah. I'm not sure I'd even come up with that sentence necessarily, but obviously, this is somebody who has a great vocabulary, can express it well, can put a sentence together well. But what they write is they eat meat, they live in Africa, they have baby cubs, lion is strong predator. And you can see from that sentence we've got, it's very simple, it's short clauses, there's no capitalization, there's no commas. So clearly, whilst they have it in their head, they don't have the ability to transfer that to paper. This is an example of data that we want to bring to meetings. Okay, so we've talked about the tests that get used. Now we're going to talk about how they are interpreted. And the questions or the things that you need to know as parents are, what do you need to know about understanding those scores? When you're looking at tests, do they include a breakdown of subtests? I'm going to explain what I mean by that. You want to be asking about the context of the tests, and you want to know what they mean in terms of academic impact. So let's just start with the score interpretation, okay? If it's an academic or a psychological test, by and large, it's going to have scores next to it. So if you go and look at your child's IEP now, and you look at the testing section, more often than not, the first thing you're going to see is a WISC test. That's the psychological test. And you're going to see a score next to various areas that they've tested for that, because they look at different areas, such as working memory and processing speed. and you will see a score, and it should say SS, and then it will give you the score, and you might even get a percentile on there as well. If you're seeing a term like raw score or scale score, ignore that. That is just what the tester used to then go away and interpret the results. That is nothing that we need to be looking at as parents, but we do need to know standard scores and percentiles and what they mean. And as you can see here, we have the average ranges, okay? So a standard score between 80 and 12 is a broad average range. In other words, if your child scores between 80 and 12, they are functioning as an average student in that particular area. Now, if they're down by 80, 81, they're at the lower end of that. And if they're up at 119, then they're at the upper end. And those translate into percentiles. So 80th would be similar to a 10th percentile. What does 10th percentile mean? It means out of 100 children, your child is functioning at the lower end, and there may be, you know, they're part of a group of that lower 10%, if you like, in terms of how they're dealing with that particular skill. So anything that you see where your child's below the 10th percentile and they've got that standard score of less than 80, you want to be asking questions, because that means that with that particular thing, that particular skill, they're likely to be struggling. Anything that's above 120 or 90th means that that is a huge strength, because they're in the top 10% of students in their age range for that particular skill. But when they're doing those tests, they're looking at lots and lots and lots of different skills. So you don't want to be honing in on, say you're looking at test results and you've got 179. Yes, you want to ask questions about it. But if you've got 179 and all of your child's other testing is coming out average, above average, then you're not going to get an IEP on that basis. We're looking for a pattern of difficulties, not something in one area. Any person in this room right now, were they to be tested, would have a range of scores, and some of us may have scores that are below 80, but we compensate for them with other things. But when we're looking at a pattern of scores in these low ranges, then we have an issue. So remember, ignore raw and scaled scores. There are other types of scoring that you're going to see when you get evaluation results, and you tend to see these areas that I've got listed here. Why is that? Well, because the academic tests tend to be tests where we've got right and wrong answers, whereas with these, they tend to be more questionnaires and scales that we're completing. So it will be, you know, you'll be asked a question, you know, does this happen sometimes, often, rarely, etc., and then the scores that come out of those, they may have something called a T-score. I'm not going to tell you, you know, a T-score of this means this, because it changes according to the test. Or they may say typical or clinically significant, much more than others, much less than others. And what we are looking for is those scores that are kind of at the extreme. So typical is fine. Clinically significant means that we've got an issue here. You know, if you've got a child who you've done a BASC, which looks at their emotional functioning, and we're looking at, you know, tendency to be depressed, and they're clinically significant, that's important. We need to know that. The subtests are where patterns emerge. And the one that kind of drives me a bit nuts is the WISC, that psychological test that the majority of schools use. I told you that they look at several domains to come up with a full scale IQ. So they look at, as I said, processing speed, working memory. I'm trying to think of the other ones that I'm getting a blank at the moment. But each of those 5 domains that they're looking at is actually based on 2 subtests. And you don't always get that information when you get those results through. So if you have a WISC and it's just giving you those 5 categories and it's not telling you anything more, you can go back and say, can I have the subtest data as well, please? So this is an example of a student who has a processing speed of 69. If you remember a couple of pages back, we said that any score below 80 means that that student is really struggling in that area. And processing speed, you know, that's how quickly does it take me to read something, write something down, copy from the board, understand the information that's being given to me. If it's low, you're going to struggle in the classroom. This student is in the 2nd percentile rank. That means out of 100 children, 98 have faster processing speed than he or she does. But there's more, okay, because that is based on 2 tests. One is called coding and one is called symbol search. Now, we don't need to focus too much on the scores here. All I want you to look at is there is a difference, all right? One of them is about a 75 and one of them is about a 55. So the 2 tests that were done to determine this child's processing speeds had slightly different results. And that can help us get clues as to how to help the child, because the symbol search is one where you need that visual discrimination and speed and attention to detail. You're looking at pictures and you're processing them and giving responses, whereas the coding one requires you to pay attention, but you're also doing a little bit of writing. You're using a pencil to do the answers for this. So with this student, we want to learn a little bit more about what's going on with their visual discrimination, the speed at which they look at things, and are they seeing all the details in pictures? That gives us some clues as to the help they need. My children always had an odd processing speed one, insofar as their coding was always much, much lower. And they both have dysgraphia. They have difficulty manipulating a pencil. So that could have been one of the reasons why that speed was brought down. Context matters enormously. Okay, so
Fiona, I just want to tell you, we've got 8 minutes left. We
yeah.
have a few questions too. So
Okay.
all right.
I'll go into warp speed. Okay. So context. What you need to know about this is when your child is being tested, they're going into a room with a psychologist or with a special ed teacher. Now, if they're tested on a bad day where they've had a bad night's sleep, maybe they didn't eat all of their lunch, they've just come out of a lesson that they really struggle with, they could underperform in that test, and it's important for you to know that. Conversely, if you've got a child who has auditory processing disorder or ADHD or autism that struggles in a noisy classroom environment, they may test extremely in this situation. So we really need to think about the context when we're looking at the results, and we need to be asking questions when we're looking at the results, especially if they don't line up, if they're very different to what we've seen before, or we can see that there's still a significant issue with something and the school's saying they don't see that there's an issue there. So context is incredibly important. The impact of, if we go back to that one that we started with at the beginning, you can take this and you can talk to someone in an office like the one I work in, or you can do some research. In a very extreme scenario, if you need the information quickly, you could even run that through something like ChatGPT and just say, what does this mean in terms of my child's learning in the classroom? The only thing I would say is if you do it with ChatGPT, please cross-check everything, because ChatGPT does get things wrong. But it is a quick way to gather some information. And so for this kid, if you remember, he was the one that had the short sentences and the verbs were wrong. Obviously, that means he's going to have some difficulty expressing his ideas, writing full sentences. He might feel nervous about participating in class discussion and so on. So what do we do next? First thing I want to tell you is if there's an average score and you're still seeing problems in that area, just remember it's one test, it's one moment in time. It is not the full story with your child. We want to know, can they generalize those skills? Can they use, can they apply what they seem to be able to do in a testing situation at home, in the classroom, etc. So don't, be ready to challenge this if you can see, if the school's saying, no, they're fine with this, but you can see there are still issues. Using results to develop IEP goals. I'm just going to very quickly say that when you look at those results that we talked about before, for example, we see that we've got a low processing speed score. Try to connect that to what you're seeing in your child. Are you seeing that, for example, when you say something to them, it takes them more than a beat to respond to you? That's a sign that they may have slow processing speed. Are you seeing that when they sit down to do homework and it's supposed to take half an hour, it's taking them an hour? That may be slow processing speed. That then enables you to ask the questions you need to ask in the CSE meeting. And those evaluations that everything that we've been talking about today, it's so important. It's part of what we call the present levels of performance in an IEP. All the decision making is going to be based on those present levels of performance. So that's going to be the results of the evaluations, all the information that's been brought to the table, plus information about how your child does in reading, writing, spelling, moving around the school, socializing, etc. If there's anything missing from that, we may miss what we need to be doing with the child, because we're going to use that information to write the goal, and then the goal is going to determine what services and supports your child gets. So the clearer the evaluation, the more comprehensive it is, the easier it is to actually put together a plan that works for your child. And it should be a plan that works for your child, not a dyslexia IEP or an autism IEP. It's your child's individual education plan. Going to whiz past this because you can go away and look at this afterwards when you get a copy. Simply, there will be times where something doesn't seem right, and this is just like a kind of flow chart to tell you, okay, for example, if the results don't match what I'm seeing, I can go back and say, okay, well, how was real life functioning considered? Okay, yeah, he came out average in the room with the psychologist, but we can see that he's still struggling with this thing when he's in the classroom. And then we would request additional information. We're not going to, we want to get away from basing any decision making on that one test where they were average, but we know they're still having issues. Independent educational evaluations, why do they get requested? Well, it might be to get a second opinion because you don't trust the opinion that you're getting so far. It could be that stuff has been missed. So that could be needs, or it could be an entire disability that's been missed. Remember that when people were training to be teachers and psychologists, etc., that could have been 10, 15 years ago, and we know more about all of these things now. So you can't expect schools to be able to pick up on absolutely everything. It's just not physically possible. You might want to get more detailed recommendations, or you might be wanting to get a formal diagnosis. And when you do that, you have to make a formal written request. I do want to emphasize here, whilst you can ask for any evaluation to be done at any time, obviously you need some justification for asking for it, something that's going on that suggests that we need to do the evaluation. But if you're asking for an independent educational evaluation, there has to have been a recent round of testing by the school. You can't just turn around 2 years after the last set of tests and say, okay, now I want an independent educational evaluation. They will say, well, why didn't you ask about it at the time? So this needs to happen quite quickly if you disagree with the results. My general advice to parents is to talk to someone like us, see if the school can do more testing first. If they do inadequate additional testing or they refuse to do the testing, then you can ask for an independent educational evaluation, and they'll either agree to it or they'll disagree. If they disagree, then we're going to due process if you want to push it further. If they agree, they'll send you an evaluator list. You do not have to use that list. You can look for your own evaluator. They do, the evaluator you find has to line up in terms of what they charge with what's going on locally, what evaluators generally charge locally. So you can use a district list, or you can find your own evaluator. If you go to due process, if you win, then the district has to do the evaluations. If you don't win, you have the option of going and paying for your own private evaluation. But remember, they only have to consider the findings. And I have seen cases where districts have paid for an independent educational evaluation and still aren't trusting the findings. So just be aware of that. And then back to where we started, that strange old section from a speech evaluation. Any questions that, we can actually ask these questions in response to any evaluation. So these are questions that you kind of want to have set to one side for when you go into meetings. What skill is it describing? Where do we see what we're being told here showing up in daily learning? Are there goals to address this area, and do the services actually teach it? And those are really important questions. So if you take nothing else away from this, take those questions. I'm done. You're muted, Julie.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you. Thank
Sorry
you
about that,
so
guys.
much, so much, Fiona. That was so much information, but in a really understandable way. So we really appreciate it. We do have a few more questions. Do you have a few minutes to
Yeah,
stay on?
yeah.
Okay. For everyone else, we'll be sending you the evaluation. Please send the evaluation. You're getting tons of applause and well deserved, Fiona. I hope you can see that on the screen.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Yeah. Um, so here's an interesting question. I've already agreed to the evaluations that should be done during a triennial evaluation and now realize I probably should have asked for more. Can you ask for more?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, just approach in writing and the
Yeah.
reason, and again, they have to evaluate in all areas of suspected disability. Um, my understanding is dyslexia is a medical diagnosis and school cannot diagnose this. If that's true, how do you rule out dyslexia?
Okay, so you do not actually have to be a physician to diagnose dyslexia. It's in well, it's a muddy area. I'm going to say that it's a very muddy area. Um, I was trained to diagnose dyslexia in the UK because the UK has what they call specialist teachers, and that's what they do. And it's to actually make sure that the kids with dyslexia get picked up quicker because we want to avoid people having to go for private evaluations. There, if you ask for the right tests, then and the school administers those tests and takes all of that information into account, you're not going to come out with a diagnosis, but you could still come out with the right services to support your child with dyslexia, theoretically. I'm going to say theoretically because the reading programs that most schools use, they are good for a number of people who experience reading issues and maybe are mildly dyslexic. But if you've got severe dyslexia, it's going to be much, much harder to get the support that your child needs because they, in some instances, they're going to need very intensive one-on-one support. But to answer your initial question, you do not have to have a diagnosis of dyslexia to have an IEP with the classification of specific learning disability.
Okay, I'm going to reframe this question a little bit, but basically, what happens if a school district says we're not going to evaluate? This is due to COVID or it's due to your child not being in school, so we're not going to evaluate.
I'd reach out to Disability Rights New York. No, you come to someone like us and we'll help you with it. I mean, they can't just refuse to evaluate. They are, as Julie has said, obligated. There's something called child find. And child find is a law that says that schools are obliged to investigate any areas of suspected disability. So they actually can't say no. I mean, I guess you
They
could.
can't say no. That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah. So, but the some will. So what they'll usually do is they won't say no outright. They'll push it off. They'll say, let's just wait and see. That's the usual response. And if they say that, you kind of just have to stick to your guns. Just make sure everything is always in writing. Because if it's not written down, it didn't happen. So we write back and we say, no, I want to go ahead with this evaluation. And if you're still getting pushback, you reach out to a nonprofit advocate like us or an organization that's going to help you with that.
Right. When you request an evaluation, the other important thing is you have to assign a consent.
Yeah.
And if the district doesn't provide you with the consent to sign, it's sort of in no man's land. So you have to make sure you request it in writing, an evaluation writing, and include the areas of your concern so that we're hitting all areas of suspected disability and make sure you're getting consent, like you're signing a consent form to evaluate. And if they're not providing it right away, ask for it. But that triggers a 60-day timeline in which they have to evaluate. And there really would be no basis for them to refuse evaluation unless they had done so, they had already evaluated within the last year. So those are kind of things. You can always also reach out to your regional associate at the Special Education Quality Assurance Unit at State Ed. We can put that in the chat maybe. All right, and I'm going to move on to the next question. My son's math assessment is on average range. Is the school required to write math goals in his IEP?
You're giving us one piece of information there. If it's in the average range, I mean, what else is going on with him? Have we looked at his day-to-day performance in math, how he does with math tests during the school year? Is there a specific area of math that he struggles with that maybe wasn't covered by the tests? If all the data we have is that he's average and he's doing fine, then no, you know, there's no reason to write goals for math.
Okay. And I think, oh, this is a good one. No, we answered that. So I think we're pretty good.
Okay, I would give one parting bit of advice to everyone. I see in parent groups often and on Facebook people saying, just go and get a private evaluation, just go and get one. That isn't necessarily going to get your child the services that they need, and you may be paying a lot of money for that private evaluation. I would strongly recommend that, first of all, you try and get the school to do the evaluation. If then you are not getting the answers that you're looking for, you have that option of asking for additional testing and getting, you know, advice and support on how to do that. Or you have the option of requesting an independent educational evaluation. I just don't want to see parents, you know, being in the disability world all this time with my own two children is not cheap. And so I don't want parents having to fork out for these things unnecessarily, because please remember that the school only has to consider the findings of a private evaluation. They do not have to abide by any of the recommendations.
The only thing I want to add to the IEE piece is that one, it's really important to choose an evaluator that will do a classroom observation, because that's something that CSE say, oh yeah, great report, but we looked at it, we're not doing anything, because that's how they performed in your office, but that's not
Yeah.
what we're seeing in school. So, you know, when you're selecting an independent evaluator, really talk to them about what they're going to do, whether they're going to write specific recommendations, whether they're willing to come to a CSE meeting to talk about their findings. Like, these are all things that are pretty important to help you advocate if you're going to get an independent evaluation. And also, Fiona, I think it's just because of the time thing, just on the, when you request an independent evaluation, and the district has two choices. They have to say yes, or they have to take you to a due process hearing, and that's at their expense. So,
Thank you
and
for
they have
that.
to prove that their evaluation was good. And honestly, just that process of filing for a hearing, getting a hearing officer, and going through that, that's typically going to be more money than they would spend on the IEE. So it is a good strategy to use, but it's not a slam dunk. So you really
Yeah,
should talk to someone about it or learn a little bit more about it before you
yeah.
go that route. But it is a good tool. Yeah, I think we've really covered everything, you know, one way or another. There's a couple on here that are super specific, and I don't think it's possible to answer without a lot more information.
So for those that are super specific, unless they're reaching out to you guys directly, I would say find out where your parent training and information center is according to where you live. Ours covers the lower Hudson Valley, and reach out to them, and they will have an advocate get in touch with you and help you.
That's great. All right. Well, again, Fiona, thank you so much. This has been so informative and helpful. And the fact that the materials are here to support it all is great. Again, this recording will be posted on our YouTube channel, so you can check that out and share it with friends as well. But we really appreciate your time.
Thank
And
you. Thank you,
everybody,
everyone.
please fill out your evaluations. And if you have suggestions for future topics, please include those as well.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.